As of now, whenever we are trying to start our application, a random database URL is being printed onto the console. The same we need to use inside the browser to connect to the H2 database console. This can be very inconvenient to someone every time check inside the logs to know the URL. Instead of following this default behavior, we can try to have a static JDBC URL by specifying some properties. Let's try to understand what are those properties. Inside this official documentation of Spring Boot supported properties, on the right hand side, you'll be able to see some links. Let me click on these data properties to see all the properties that are supported by Spring Boot around the database. If you are using Cassandra, you need to use these properties. If I can scroll down, there are Couchbase related properties. Similarly, there are MongoDB related properties, Redis related properties. But the property that I'm looking here is spring.datasource.url. It will be somewhere here, or I can search for datasource.url. Using the spring.datasource.url, we can specify what is a JDBC URL of the database. Similarly, using spring.datasource.username, we can specify the usernames. Let's try to use these properties and customize our H2 database behavior. I'm going to type s.d.u and select the spring.datasource.url. To this, we need to provide the value as jdbc:/h2:mem: and testdb. You need to make sure you're following the jdbc h2 mem as it is. You should not change that. But coming to the database name, you can give any name. Here I'm trying to give this testdb as a name. With the help of these URL, now every time I try to restart my application, always my Spring database, it is going to use this value as the data source URL. Followed by, let me try to mention spring.datasource.username. By default, H2 it is going to use SA as a username. The same I'll try to use. Now coming to the password. For the password also, I'm going to leave it as blank. I'm trying to use the default values. Usually in the real projects, developers will not use the default username and password. They will try to provide their own username and password. But since we are trying to learn the H2 database, we should be fine with these default values. Next, I'm going to create a property spring.datasource.driver class name. To this, I need to mention org.h2.driver as a value. This is completely optional because Spring Boot is smart enough to identify the driver details based upon the dependencies that we have defined inside the pom.xml. But in general, it is a good practice to define these properties so that if someone is trying to look at your properties, they can easily understand what is the database that you're trying to use. Are you using H2 database or are you using MySQL database? All such details they can quickly grasp by looking at your properties. Once we define these properties, we can try to perform a build and restart our application. This time inside the logs, you should be able to see the static JDBC URL that we have defined, jdbc:/h2:mem:/testdb. The same we need to mention inside the browser as well while you are trying to connect to the H2 database. Let's confirm the same. I'm going to refresh this page and it is going to ask me the details again. Under JDBC URL, this time I'm going to mention the static URL that we have defined. Username, it will be SA and password will be empty. As soon as I click on this connect, I will be able to see my database console. As a next step, let's try to set up some data inside our H2 database. To set up some data, first we need to create the table, followed by we can try to load some data into that table. We can either manually execute the scripts inside this console or we can give the responsibility of creating the table and data to the Spring Boot. There is a technique that we can follow. Whenever you are using H2 database, you can define your table related scripts under the resources folder with a file name as schema.sql. Let me create a new file with the name schema.sql. Inside this schema.sql, I'm going to mention SQL scripts that are going to help me in creating the table with the name products. Inside this products table, we are going to have fields like product ID, name, description, price, popularity, image URL, created at, created by, updated at, and updated by. Product ID is going to be the primary key for my table. I hope you are able to understand this script. It's very simple. First, you need to understand what is the column name, followed by what is the data type of the column, followed by whether it is going to be nullable column or not null column, For nullable columns, I have mentioned the default value as null. You don't have to type this SQL script. You can get this SQL script from the GitHub repo. I'm telling to the Spring Boot to create a table with the name products if it is not exist only. If it is already exist in the memory database, then it is not going to create this table based upon this condition I have defined. Once the table is created, we need to set up the data inside this table. To set up the data, we need to create another SQL file with the name data.sql. Please make sure you are following the same naming convention because these are the default file names for which my Spring Boot application is going to look during the startup of the application. Inside this data.sql as well, I'm going to paste good amount of insert scripts. I'm trying to insert 30 different records into my products table. Please get these insert scripts as well from the GitHub repo. Once we create these .sql files, this time a magic is going to happen. Let me try to restart my application. During the startup of my application, by default, my Spring Boot and H2 database, they're going to look for schema.sql and data.sql files under the resources folder. If they are present, first schema.sql is going to be executed, followed by data.sql. This time, if I try to refresh my H2 console page and connect again, you'll be able to see there is a products table created inside my H2 database. And if I try to execute the select query on my products table, you'll be able to see all the 30 different records that Spring Boot inserted during the startup of the application. This behavior of database initialization during the startup is only applicable for embedded database like H2 database by default. I can go to the application.properties. I'll try to show you the default value of a property. The property name is spring.sql.init.mode. By default, embedded is the value that is going to be considered by the Spring Boot framework. With this embedded, the database initialization will happen only for the embedded databases like H2 database. Whereas if you select never, then the database initialization will never happen regardless of what type of database you're trying to use. If you select always, the database initialization will always happen regardless of which database you're trying to use. But in general, we don't have to touch these default values because in real applications, we are going to use MySQL database and the required data and table structure might have already set up by the database administrators. Developers, they never have to worry about creating the schema and data into the database tables. That's why always don't try to change this default embedded value. But in case if you want to disable the database initialization for H2 database also, you can use never as a value. Anytime if you are looking to know more details about a specific property, you can click on that property and press F1 shortcut. And that is going to show you the documentation around that property. So here they clearly highlighted more to apply when determining whether the initialization should be performed. The default value is embedded and the other values that it is going to support is always, embedded and never. I hope you're clear. Let me close this documentation. As of now, we are saving the schema.sql and data.sql under the resources folder where my Spring Boot is expecting. But if you want, you can save them in a different location and you can let that folder location to the Spring Boot by using some properties. Let's try to understand how to do the same. This time, I'm going to create a new folder under the resources. The folder name is going to be SQL. Under this SQL, I'm going to move this schema.sql and data.sql. Now this time, if I try to restart my application, though my Spring Boot is going to perform the database initialization, it is not going to create any table and data because the SQL files are not present in the default location. If I try to refresh this page and connect to the H2 database, this time there is no products database. Here you may have a question which is, previously we created products table and products data. Where the data went? This is one of the drawback of H2 database. H2 database always will be initialized from scratch during the startup of the application. Every time you start your application, you're going to get a brand new database. This is a huge drawback. That's why we should not use the H2 database in production applications. Of course, there is a workaround that we can follow to overcome this disadvantage, which I'm going to discuss in the next lecture. But right now, let's focus on the problem that we are facing. As of now, though I have defined my SQL files under SQL folder, my Spring Boot is not able to detect them because they are present in some other folder location. I need to let about my Spring Boot about this new folder location. I can achieve this very easily with the help of some properties. The property is spring.sql.init.schema location. Here you need to mention where your file is present. The file is present inside our class path. That's why we need to first type class path followed by SQL folder where we have saved the schema.sql. When you are using this property, there is no mandatory that you need to name your SQL file as schema.sql. You can name the file name as whatever you want. In the similar lines, we should also define another property to provide the data related SQL. Let me type spring.sql.init.data locations. And to this also we need to mention class path :SQL/data SQL. If you try to read the documentation of this property by pressing F1, you'll be able to see the documentation clearly highlights location of the data DML scripts to apply to the database. When you define these properties and if the given file is not present inside your project or inside your class path, the startup of your application is going to fail. For example, if I mention schema1 and data1 here and try to start my application again, I'm going to get a runtime exception during the startup of the application. We can avoid these exceptions by mentioning optional. Just before class path, I'm going to mention optional. With this optional, I'm telling to the Spring Boot, if these files are not present, don't throw any runtime exception. Please go ahead and start my application. I'm fine even if there is no data inside my H2 database. This is what we are communicating. If I try to restart my application, this time there won't be any exceptions. And at the same time, there won't be any data and tables as well inside my H2 database because these files are nowhere existed inside my application. Let me correct the file names to schema.sql and data.sql. I'm going to retain this optional. There is no harm mentioning them. Let me save this file, do the build and restart my application. Let me refresh my browser and connect to the H2 database again. This time you'll be able to see there is a products table and inside the products table, I have this data.